Hey everyone, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, talk about the art and the science of the things that we put on our feet. Today we have Dr. Salas and myself, Matt, Dr. Klein, whatever you want to call me, and we have a very special topic that I think the whole team takes to heart. But I'm curious to know what all of you think with this, and we'll have a little question for you at the beginning. But Dr. Salas, how relevant do you think this topic is before we tell them what it is? Although they probably just read the tagline, so they already know what this is.
Yeah, there's a good chance they probably already know what they're signing up for. But
surprise ruin.
But I think it's pretty important because I think it does have direct implications on both standing and moving postures and walking, running, etc., which is what we talk about. So I think it's definitely relevant.
So we are going to talk about heel bevels, which you may have guessed either from listening or probably reading the title of this video podcast, whatever medium you're going through. And we do talk about heel bevels a lot, especially me, because I tend to be very sensitive as a pretty aggressive heel striker as to what's happening at the back of the shoe. But we finally decided to go, hey, let's sit down and talk about this, and not just talk about it for running shoes, but also walking, and kind of explain why we talk about it, the purpose of this thing, why you should even bother having this, and then talk about some examples and how this can change and how individual factors, both in the person and the shoe, might influence this stuff. So, David, would you mind starting us off on a definition of what a heel bevel is?
Yeah, I think a great way to think about it is thinking about what a bevel is, first off. And so essentially, like, what a bevel is a rounding of an edge. And so whether you're using some kind of a tool or like you're curbing something or whatever it is, in this case, it's a shoe and it's the heel. And so it's the rounding of the platform at the heel. And one of the main reasons why they put that there is to kind of mimic our human anatomy and kind of optimize movement through the rear foot. And should I go into that right now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Definitely.
But yeah, basically when we're walking and going through the gait cycle, most people, like, we always say that this word pronation kind of gets demonized, but it's kind of a natural part of shock absorption and how we walk. And most people, when they extend their leg out in front of them, they're going to land on their heel. And usually it's going to be slightly off to the side on the outside side of it. And they'll kind of roll downwards and they'll roll inwards. And that's that pronation moment for shock absorption. Eventually, as they get into their forefoot, that midfoot will tighten up, they'll resupinate, and they'll kind of create a stiff lever arm to push off of through their great toe, and or if they have a Morton's toe, the second toe. But in some cases, but nonetheless, that is essentially the process. And so when they design a heel bevel or put it into a shoe, the idea is to essentially mimic that movement and help ease that pathway. And in some ways, kind of recreate the rounding that you might see in the heel rocker of your calcaneus. So,
at least they're supposed to design it like that. That's a thing we'll talk about. Yeah. The other thing, so Dr. Celeste is talking about how there's multiple planes of motions that are involved with how you design a heel bevel and why it is. So he mentioned that most people, and we get this question all the time, hey, I see I'm landing on the outside of the heel and there's some wear on the posterior lateral side. That's totally normal. People typically tend to land on the posterior lateral side of the heel. They roll inwards, and typically there's a movement pathway that's going generally toward the first or second toe, depending on how things go, with some variation there. So that's adding a little bit of, as I keep hitting my computer and people can see me bouncing, that's a little bit of like diagonal and frontal plane, side to side stuff. But when you get in the pure sagittal plane, front to back, the reason we generally suggest that the heel be beveled, most companies do this, is because your heel bone is also rounded. And the purpose of that rounding is actually to make gait more efficient. When you're walking, if you landed on a jagged heel, it would pivot your foot forward really quickly. And if you have really fast motions like that, that's more force, that's more energy to control your foot slapping down on the ground when you make initial contact. Okay, that puts a lot of pressure through some of the muscles on the front of your leg, like your anterior tibialis, some of your extensor muscles. Very common for people with shoes that don't have a great bevel. When they start running, some people might notice some shin splint type pain. The muscles are working really hard because they have a very strong pull on eccentric force to control that motion down. Now, that takes a lot of energy. Okay, if you round the heel, which your heel bone naturally does, it actually makes your gait more efficient and naturally rolls you forward, which saves energy and reduces the amount of force you need to control that motion downwards and reduces stress there as well. This is very effective in walking and heel strikers for runners. The other reason that this is really, really, really important is because when you start getting a shoe higher and higher off the ground, so I would say minimalist shoes don't really need a bevel because they're so close and there's typically a rounding anyway. When you get these maximal shoes, you want to still maintain this thing called a heel rocker. So that natural curve actually has that the efficiency it gives you has a name called the heel rocker because it helps rock you forwards. Now, if you take that away, it oftentimes increases the energy cost of gait from that place. It's the same thing. There's a heel, midfoot, and forefoot rocker. Each one of these things make you more efficient, and there are parts of your anatomy that do that. You take them away, it increases the energy cost of locomotion and gait. So it's not just hey, this is a more comfortable thing. It's also something that makes you more efficient naturally.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. Well, we team effort on this. We do well. So we kind of talked about what it is, what the purpose is, right? It's to help make gait both more efficient as well as more comfortable. Because you might have experienced like a dress shoe is a great example because they typically don't have a good bevel. And you'll notice they're like really stiff. When you land on the heel, it's kind of slappy, doesn't feel very good. It just helps smooth that out. We will talk about there are some cases in certain unique populations, you may not want that. But for the majority of people, it really is something that works with the anatomy. So are there any other reasons you can think of that might really be helpful to have a heel bevel in the shoe?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it with some special considerations before with those that either have that have some kind of a need for a rocker design. Because usually if they're implementing a heel bevel, more often than not, there's usually some kind of a forefoot rocker implemented in the shoe as well to essentially give you a rocker profile. That would kind of go a little bit off the topic of the conversation, but like special considerations for people that may have, like stiff ankles and they can't move through the entire range and maybe they need a little bit of help getting over it, or stiff great toes, et cetera, those types of more orthopedic in nature type things, or if they have some kind of a neurologic issue where they just literally can't move through in a certain pathway. And maybe that helps them facilitate some of the gait and the movement and getting that literal rocker profile going on their own body. That's
great. I'm also trying to think, we kind of touched on a lot of stuff and the accelerated past where kind of my outline was, but that's okay. David hit some really good points there. The group that I often think about when I'm not thinking about just comfort level of a shoe, especially personally, I'm also thinking of those people that maybe have some pathology or some kind of irritation where a bevel tends to reduce that load. So I mentioned shin splints is like the low back pain of the lower extremity. It's a really general catch-all term. It doesn't tell you kind of what tissue is actually irritated. But especially for new runners or runners that have sensitivity in the anterior shin, this really reduces load in that area, can make it much easier to get forward rather than having that really slapping kind of sensation. It's also really important for gait in terms of efficiency. So if you're a longer distance runner, you're a longer distance athlete, this is really important because typically as you slow down, as the distance of the event increases, it is very natural to end up more on your heel. It's more economical. This is not a heel versus forefoot debate. There's research on this that you go shorter, faster, people tend to be more on the front of their foot in terms of initial contact. As you go longer, people typically tend to land more on the heel. So it's also, just making the shoe more efficient for longer periods. But the comfort is probably one of the biggest things for me personally, and reducing that load on some of those muscles in the front. And so shin splint type pain is super common in newer runners. So when people ask us about this, one of the biggest things I suggest is make sure if you're getting a new shoe, it doesn't have to be the most expensive thing, but look for that bevel. The other thing that the bevels can actually do that David actually mentioned quite a while ago already was talking about how it can influence some of the frontal planar side-to-side stuff. So if you have a good posterior lateral bevel, it can really change how quickly you either pronate or don't, because if you don't have one and you have a lot of what's called a lateral flare, and for those looking, I've got, what's a good example? Do we have a good example of this?
Of a lateral flare?
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the Topo Spectre 2.
Trainer has some.
Nah, I didn't think that was not that bad. But you know what? I'm going to bring up Mount to Coast, who I've been enjoying the P1, which is their stability shoe. You can see the sole kind of comes, for those of you watching on this, the sole kind of pops out the side. And so when you have that happen, when you land on that posterior lateral side, it's going to pivot you inwards more, right? Increases the lever arm. There's a greater moment that kind of drives you in there. So you're going to get pushed inwards faster with more force to get through this greater motion. So that might accelerate how much you go in that direction. For somebody that actually needs to learn to pronate, that actually might be great. For the rest of us, like myself, we're really sensitive to that might not be very good. And there's shoes that are supposed to be stability shoes that, because they have that, all of a sudden, because there's that excessive lateral flare and not posterior lateral bevel, can be a little challenging. We were talking, one of the things that actually spurred this conversation on was talking about the Hoka Skyflow, where it's supposed to have this nice bevel, and they actually have a pretty solid lateral flare on this. And even though there is, like, I don't know, David, does this look like a posterior lateral flare? I cannot tell. Like, I've been looking at this and staring. I'm like, is it? What is it? Because the shoe is supposed to have a good bevel, but it ends up like I kind of land weirdly on it, and it pitches me inward.
Yeah, it almost kind of has like a little bit of a wedge-like feel to it, right? Yeah. Where there's like almost like a slight disposition to kind of shift you.
Yeah.
And I think that is an interesting shoe to bring up specifically, because I actually really like the shoe.
Yeah.
But I do agree that the bevel is much like more gradual, and it's much earlier.
Yeah.
And you're definitely going to have a little bit more of an impact on that posterior lateral heel. It's not quite as rounded as some of the other models they've made.
Yeah.
So if you land pretty aggressively there, you're really going to feel it, and you're going to kind of have that. I describe it like a wedge. Like if you kind of put inside of your shoe a little angle of foam, and it's just like a little triangle there, and you just wedge it onto the outside of where you're stepping in, you're going to feel your foot kind of roll inwards, and it's going to kind of pitch you that way.
Yep.
But not in a fluid way, if that makes sense. Because we were saying with the posterior lateral bevel, that's kind of the idea of it, but it does it in a way that's natural with your biomechanics. In this situation, you're doing that because you're hitting something.
Right.
And then coming off of it. So it's a very jarring type of way of getting there.
We should probably clarify that, again, a lot of people, when they look at a bevel, they're just looking at how curved the back is just in one plane. But we're also talking about making sure you're thinking about like it as a 3D motion, because the heel isn't just this, it doesn't just have this rigid like curve at the back. It's like the whole thing is rounded. Mm-hmm. So if you want to do a heel bevel really well, yes, you should have an upward curve, but you should also have some rounding around the side. To be honest, the best heel bevel I think I've ever seen has come from Ultra recently, where they like rounded the entire heel rather than just the back.
Oh yeah, they've done a couple of shoes. Yeah.
Yeah. They did a couple options on that. But David brings up a really good point, is that what we haven't addressed so far is, yes, okay, how curved is it, right? Is there a rounding, especially on that posterior lateral side? But probably the other thing that we have to talk about is what would you call this? The rate of the bevel? Is it gradual or aggressive? Because you can have a bevel, but if it's really steep, it's going to like push you forward really quick, and it may still feel like there's not that, versus, you know, we have a love-hate relationship with the New Balance. Is it Bevels? Balos?
I say Balos.
I'm going to go with David.
I have no idea, though.
But so, David, why don't you like this shoe again? Because your foot got hurt in it? No, you do like it. Yeah.
I love how like I was like, oh, I'm not going to throw this shoe under the bus. And like everyone goes in comments like, it's fine, David. It's the Bevels. So how did everyone know?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a pretty aggressive one there. It's a big rocker on the heel. It extends very far up as far as the rear foot's concerned. And it's so rounded that you're kind of almost always pitched forward because of how well it's rounded. Like it's a pretty good one if you respond well to that type of geometry. And not to say that I responded bad to it per se. I think my foot didn't agree with it for other reasons. Very, very soft, compliant foam. The rubber isn't really rubber. It's kind of like a rubberized EVA that has color on it. So it's really soft.
Yeah.
And there's not that much like stability through the midfoot. So I felt like my intrinsic foot muscles, like how we're talking about the transitions of the gait cycle, like we're kind of skipping that initial contact to some degree. Yeah. Like it's happening, but it's very, very quick. And then now everything in my midfoot is having to basically create that stable moment and then lever off and push off. And that stiffness of being able to just like be compliant and stiffen up at that quick of a rate over and over and over again, as fun as the shoe felt, it actually was a really fun ride. I enjoyed it, but I just couldn't run in it. Like it would just hurt. It would hurt my foot. Yeah, that's out there. You got it out of me.
Yeah, that's okay. So I think so this is where we talk about individuality, is the size of the bevel can make some major impacts on your gait. I forget what company did it, but they did some kind of unpublished research that suggested that I think it might have been Brooks. It was Brooks or Skechers that suggested that the larger the bevel, it actually moved your initial contact point a little bit farther forward. So for me, I've always done really, really well with large bevels because I tend to land really far back, and getting me a little farther forward to me feels good. Also, I slam the back of the heel, so any help I can get transitioning forward is really, really good. So, but for a lot of people, this might be too aggressive because it might change where they're landing. And if that is something they're sensitive to, that might be a problem. So for this design works really, really well for me. I like large bevels like this that go really far forward, whereas small ones don't work as well. Do you have an example of a really small one?
Yeah. I mean, the Ghost Max.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
that's a great example,
especially for how big the shoe is. So we were talking about earlier, like with how much foam is under some of these shoes, it's that much more important to have a rounding because that lever arm is now longer. And so if you don't have some way of easing that transition off of that initial contact and coming down, we're talking about all that load that goes to your tibialis anterior, that just went up, like that just skyrocketed like crazy. Yeah. And so it doesn't feel good. It feels very slappy, those types of things. If the shoe is like that, and I'm not going to say that's for everyone in the Ghost Max, but for someone like Klein, this probably
Ghost Max isn't going to do.
Or Ghost Max 2. Ghost Max
2. Yeah.
Correction. Yes.
Yep.
But if you look at it, it doesn't really take much looking at it to realize that's pretty flat for the shoe.
Yeah.
And it's very minimally rounded. It exists. It's just really small.
Right.
And there's just not much. It's almost like they just rounded the very back off, but didn't actually create a true like rounding through the heel.
Right.
And so that's one where it's a little bit more of a shank almost, where you're going to, like for standing, it's actually pretty comfortable, I think.
Yeah. Standing and walking, actually, that shoe is pretty solid, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for running, if you're putting that much force into the ground, and if you're someone like Klein, where you're just a little bit further back, you're now increasing the load on that shin and your quads, and like it's going up a lot, and it's probably not the most enjoyable. And I don't think he had a very great time in that shoe.
No.
Yeah, someone like me, I probably could get away with it, but
if you land farther forward and you totally, like, you don't even hit the heel, this is going to be a non-issue for you. But for heel strikers, which is over 70% of the running population, like, you'll notice that. But I have to give the Ghost Max 2 some credit because I feel like that shoe was designed more, and this might offend some people, more for a variety of like walkers, right? So the Dyad is kind of where this got inspired by, where the Dyad and other kind of pure walking shoes typically don't, and like, especially when we're talking about like orthopedic shoes, people are generally needing, they may not have the most smoothest gait. They might need a little bit more stiffness because we might have some issues either rocking backwards or a variety of areas. For walking, for people with some balance issues, a less rockered shoe actually might be a better option, because one of the complaints people will have with a large posterior bevel is if you lean back at all, it just rolls backwards. So anybody, again, if you're talking about neurologic population, talking about maybe the individual that doesn't have some great like balance reactions, a not large bevel might be a better option. Also, if you're not worried about compressing things as much, like you're not not a runner, walker, a smaller bevel might be fine because you're compressing. You don't go through as big of an arc of motion as you do with running. For walking too, have you tried walking in the Bevels?
That wasn't the most fun.
It's kind of awkward. And it's like, it's because this shoe is really designed for running. Large bevelers are going to do better with faster transitions and greater forces. So with walking, you may not need as big of a bevel. And a shoe that I really thought about, that I've really enjoyed recently, the On Cloud Runner 2, for those who can see it, has a really well-positioned posterolateral bevel. And the foam is nice. It's on the firmer side, but it does compress more with running. And I've loved this shoe for both walking and running, where it's got a solid, well-placed posterolateral bevel, but it's not the most massive thing on the planet, yet it still works really, really well for both walking and running. Is it a little firm for running? Yeah, it is, but I typically like a little firmer ride, and the posterolateral bevel is placed well enough that it doesn't bother me, but it's also not big enough that it doesn't feel awkward while walking. So there is a balance, right? And we're not saying that every shoe needs to have this giant, massive bevel, that the whole shoe needs to be this crazy rocker, although some people might need that. We're just saying there is an optimal place to put this thing, and it should at least have at least a small to moderate one. And if you're getting into running, you're going to want to have at least a moderate sized one because of the forces that go with it. That's just how things go, right? In relation to the posterolateral bevel, although I personally like this, and I think, David, hopefully I'm not speaking for you, that you do as well. You do have to be a little careful with the small population of people that have any kind of lateral ankle stability issues. Like people that tend to roll their ankles a lot, a strong posterolateral bevel you might not like. And a company that does that very well, it creates a massive posterolateral bevel, is Adidas. So I'm holding the Adidas Adios Pro 3 up. The 2 was incredibly aggressive. And I would say
that one was a little too much, I think.
That was almost like had a stability shoe heel. The Boss is another great example where there's just the bevel is done really well, but the majority of bevel is on the lateral side. And what that does when you have a very large posterolateral bevel that's really pushed, like really curved on the outside and not so much on the inside, is it actually creates almost like a wedge / post in the heel. So people like myself that pronate really aggressively do great, right? It makes the shoe feel more stable. There's some resistance to some medial motions, inward motion. But people that are like unstable laterally or go too far laterally, they're going to hate it because they're like, oh, it feels unstable. It feels like my ankle's going off the platform. So again, while we talk about this, not to use the old PT thing, it does depend. Although as I'm trying to teach, I just started teaching at a university, George Fox. I'm trying not to torture the students with it depends. I'm trying to say context of the individual is appropriate, that there are a variety of needs, and what those needs look like may vary.
Yeah. I agree completely.
So I usually get really annoyed when there's a medial bevel. Like, I forget what's an example of this?
Every once in a while you see one.
Yeah. Who was it that someone recently? And I'm like, why would you do that? Like that, people don't land on the, like, do they? Am I missing this? Can you fact check me? Are there people that land on the medial side of their foot?
I mean, if they supinate really hard, I mean, maybe. It'd still be, I think, more of a midfoot, forefoot type of a pattern anyways.
Yeah, I've never seen, and like, not that
like
the apps
rolling this way. Yeah.
The like land medial and like roll outward, like, or land on the, I'm sorry, I keep using, I know people don't always know what medial means. Medial is the inside, lateral is the outside. So like landing on the inside and rolling out, like I've never seen that. It would look
weird.
I've seen people land. Yeah.
Oh, and I made the comment about like I thought that one might have been a little too much. I was talking about the Pro 2, not Pro 3. For me.
Yeah. Wait,
Adios
say
Pro.
That again?
Adios Pro 2.
Oh, yeah. That's I agree. Yes, that one was pretty aggressive. I liked it, but I think the majority of the population was like, no, that was too much.
I will say too, like one thing consideration when looking at the whole shoe is if you're going to do a design like that, you have to have good forefoot stability too.
Yes.
Because if that transitions really fast, one shoe that I think does that beautifully is the Takumi Sen 9.
Yes.
Where you have a very fast, quick transitioning heel and midfoot, but then that forefoot's just solid. And whether you're pronating hard or supinating, whatever, like that thing is just locked in and it's grippy and it's like a solid platform to push off of.
Right.
So like looking at considerations of the goals of the shoe can definitely change your indications of how you want to implement the bevel. And I just want to show one shoe really quick, which is kind of the radical opposite of what we're talking about. But the Saucony Kinvara, what number are we on now? 15.
15, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a shoe a little bit lower to the ground, a little bit more of a flexible design, and it's a much flatter profile, right? They have a bevel. It's not huge. So they don't really need a big one. The second you land, that thing flexes and does its own thing. So it's just another example of like you were saying, like shoes that have flatter bevels. And like it can be for a couple different reasons, whether it's sometimes going fast and something a little bit lower to the ground that might actually feel nicer as well.
Yep. The other consideration I almost forgot to mention when designing a bevel or looking at one is how much the foam compresses. So the Super Blast is a really great example of this, where the bevel here, it's a large bevel, but it's very centered. So we should probably have talked about, so posterior lateral means the bevel is shifted off to the side. When we talk about centered, it means the thing's very like even. There's no curve on the outside. It's mostly rounded up toward the back. Now, if you have a really soft foam, you may not need a posterior lateral bevel because the foam might just compress that way anyway. And if you put too much of an aggressive one, you'll roll out too far. A lot of the super shoes do this, not all of them, but a lot of them do this because the companies know, hey, when you land on that posterior lateral aspect, that foam's going to compress so much that if we add too much of a posterior lateral bevel, that you're just going to go flying that direction. Unless you're me and just loves that in general, right? So the Saucony Endorphin Pro 4 is a great example of this, where they've got a large posterior bevel, but it's fairly centered because that lateral midsole material actually compresses a little bit more than the medial side. So they know, yeah, you're going to, if you land your heel, that's going to compress and create that posterior lateral bevel for you and roll you forwards. That's assuming, of course, the person's like running, like compressing the foam at the right rate. And that's a different conversation that we can talk about. But yeah, that's where like the Super Blast, I looked at it, I'm like, this is not going to work for me. But it does because it just compresses so well on that lateral side because the foam is relatively soft.
Yeah, totally. And you see that a lot with the super shoes too.
Yeah.
Just generally speaking. Yeah.
And I think that's why the Adidas Adizero Adios Pro 2 was just so unstable for people, because it not only had that softer foam, but it had a huge posterior lateral bevel too. So people were like rolling off the side. You know, even the crazier one was the Adidas, the Primex series, where they would have that, except with 50 millimeters of heel of midsole material plus that same massive bevel. And we got all these stories like people like literally breaking their ankles because they'd roll their foot in that. The Primex Strong 2 was slightly better, but it's still, because it's firmer, but that, you gotta be careful with those. Designing 50 millimeter stack height shoes is a totally different crazy story. So
yeah, Primex 1, man, that was wild.
That was nuts. Speaking of wild, if we're going to talk about crazy heel bevels, I got to bring up the Mizuno Wafer Rebellion Pro Series. Like, so wait,
what a transition.
Do we call this a bevel? So for people that are listening to this shoe is nuts. First of all, the first version was crazy. I think they made this more aggressive in the second one, where like they cheat is not the right word. They figured out how to get around things by adding more, like increasing the height of the heel. Like this is a really high stack height shoe, but then they cut the heel in a way and bevel it so that it's technically still, when you measure it per the world standards, it's still under the limit. How would you describe this heel?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, it's an aggressively beveled heel, right? Like
maybe the most aggressive. Yeah,
it's almost like you took a slab of foam, and let's just simplify this. We'll make it a rectangle, so it's not even on a shoe.
Yeah.
And then you go and you look at the bottom right corner of that foam and you draw a triangle and you just go up about half the height of that foam and then do a long diagonal cutting that way. That's essentially what they did. It's like there's a slab of foam just missing. Yeah. And it's a pretty dramatic heel bevel, but it works really well for the shoe. The way they have that plate designed, it actually flows pretty well, but it definitely keeps you very forward.
Yes.
Keeps you very much on your midfoot and through your forefoot. It's a very lively feeling shoe. And some people that might feel a little too aggressive, but some people are going to really love it. And it's a fun shoe. I like the Rebellion Pro too.
Yeah, me too. I've noticed that for me, like if I'm like really back far on my heel, it feels pretty clunky. Like you're trying to get over this. There's a pivot point where it finally ends. You kind of have to get over. And the sweet spot is either landing right on the pivot point, or there's a name for this that I'm totally forgetting that we should know. It's like
it was Mizuno who was doing the heel bevel stuff where they were playing with the angles.
Yes, but what's the is it the apex? Is that the term I'm looking for?
I think so.
Of like where the thing ends?
Yeah,
is that the right term? Yeah.
Where the point at which it like rounds, like where so they angle it. Yeah.
The apex is super far forward, but if you land on that, and somebody in the comments correct us, please, if that's wrong. if you land on this part, it actually trampolines you forward. Or if you're like Andrew, who also really loves this shoe, if you land for that 4-foot midfoot, it's perfect. So this is a great example, like a more extreme example of what happened with the Bevels, where if you respond, it will push you forward and make you land farther forward. If you're more of an extreme heel striker, this might not work. It might work. I don't know. That's a great thought.
It's so dramatic that you'd have to just try it at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had a perfect heel on a shoe, what would that look like for you? How would you design that? There's one more element that we need to talk about that I almost forgot about, but that we'll get to after this. But
okay. Yeah. So I think in a daily training shoe, I don't need that much. So as long as there's a rounding through the heel, I do like a little bit of a lateral bias. Doesn't have to be quite as aggressive as some of the other shoes we're talking about. If it's a little bit more of a moderate stack height, like the Takumi Sen, I really like that type of a profile for running fast. I think that's a very fun type of geometry. But for daily training, I don't need it quite as aggressively. As long as it's rounded a little bit and it has a little bit of compression, like how you alluded to with the Super Blast 2, that is something that can agree with me. And so that's why I think the Sky Flow, even though it has that slight little flare to it, it didn't really bother me that much. And I actually kind of liked the general stiffness of the rest of the platform and the sole flaring, and I just had a nice, pleasant ride on it. But I don't land quite as far back into the side as you do.
Right.
And so, like, if I was there, like, that could totally feel jarring. So for me, I don't need it to be too aggressive. You know, I just need it to have a little bit of rounding and I do like a little bit of a directional bias. A shoe that does that pretty well, actually. Wait, when is this going to air?
In like a week or two.
What's the date today?
It is
the
8th. So
okay,
2 weeks.
Never mind. I can't talk about it. Wait,
yeah, for those of you who don't know, we usually we record this and then we release. It usually releases 2 weeks later, so sometimes we have to be a little careful with the shoes that we're talking about because they're embargoes, and we try to be really respectful of companies because we know that they're a business and they're trying to also make a living. So we try not to judge. But
yeah, it's a company that has an N and a B in it, but they did a good job with a slight deviation to the posterior lateral side on a shoe. I will not say the shoe. And you'll hear all about it when the time comes, which isn't that far in the future. They might release. We might have the clearance.
Why can't we? All right, we'll play it safe.
We'll play it safe, but like we might be good. I just
it's a classic shoe that's been out there for like 14 years. Like, come on, right? Is that correct?
Something like that. I think so. Maybe yeah, I think it's number 14. I think. Okay.
Yeah, forget it.
Yeah. I think it is. Yeah. Anyways, that shoe has a good job of having a gradual heel bevel, but having a slight lateral bias, but it's not that aggressive, you know, and it's just enough to kind of help facilitate that motion without getting in the way of anything else.
Yep. So I would say, and you kind of answered this like ahead of time, just for me, as someone who really lands very strongly at that posterior lateral side, if the foam isn't going to compress well enough for me to actually transition through the shoe without feeling like I'm getting pitched inwards, I just like that. Even just a slight posterior lateral bevel is good. But I do appreciate at least a moderate bevel in all shoes. As a heel striker, as someone whose mechanics may not be that different, walking versus running, having that well, that's not true. My running mechanics are very different. Let me switch that. They're very different. Having something that helps me transition forward is really, really important because I am one of those people that experienced some mild kind of shin splint symptoms when I first started running, right? I need that help with that transition forward. Do I get on my forefoot all the time? Yeah, I do. Is that all the time? No, I just tend to be, my knee and my shins tend to be a little sensitive when there isn't a bevel because I feel that because I have to get myself forward. It doesn't need to be too aggressive. And I will say the Adios Pro 2 felt really good for shorter distances. I did try to take that for a 20K and by like 15K, I was dying because I was just getting rolled out too much. So there is such a thing as too much, but I would encourage companies to really look at, yes, either having things centered or if they know the foam's going to compress well enough or slightly posterior lateral would be very, very helpful. Or you could go the ultra route and have the whole thing rounded like the heel,
just the whole thing. Yep.
That might make it unstable for people with like severe like lateral stability. So that's why I say it has to depend a little bit, right? You have to know your customer, know who the shoe's being meant for, and have some options. So wait, that's a great example, by the way, of a really aggressive bevel, which for me, it tends to be a little clumpy because it's so sharp. But how do you deal with that? And what shoe is that? So the listeners know.
Yeah, so for the listeners, I'm holding up the Brooks Hyperion Max 2, which is a pretty big shoe right now. People are liking it.
They really are. It's been really positive. Yeah.
And I like it a lot too, especially for daily miles. Kind of like what we were talking about earlier. I don't really need it to be rounded that far up as long as it's rounded a little bit. So this one's aggressive, but it's short. So it doesn't extend super far into the midfoot there. It's just like that little bit. And so that's why, like, if you kind of need a little bit more of a transitionary kind of heel bevel there, like that, this might not be the shoe for you. That might feel a little bit jarring, like you're describing. Yep. But if you just need a little bit of rounding and you're kind of already kind of forward, just naturally, like that is a shoe that will do that for you. It just basically gives you the rounding that you need and nothing else. And so aggressive initially, but it doesn't extend very far anterior or forward.
I find that shoe works really, really well for me while walking and while running very quick. That moderate pace doesn't work well because I'm just a little bit farther back, but other people are going to have different experiences. But you are doing a great job with reminding me that to bring this last topic up, as we have just jumped all over the place, about the fact you can have a bevel, but how it's shaped can have a big impact on how it actually functions. The other end of the spectrum is a shoe like the Puma Mag Max, which also has been fairly popular. This is a great shoe, for example, of where Andrea and I really had different experiences because she lands more forward and thought the bevel was fine. I didn't because there's a lot of posterior flare. Posterior flare is where the sole extends beyond where the heel is backwards. So what that typically does is when you have a lot of posterior flare, basically means you're going to hit the ground early and transition forward. So it kind of like undoes the whole point of a bevel. So you could still have this beveled, but especially if that bevel is really sharp like this shoe, it still might feel like there's an early landing on almost like the heel is not beveled and then kind of undoes it somewhat for someone like me. Other people have reported this is not an issue for them. I'm sure if you can land at the right spot, compress the heel, it's great. But again, angles matter is what we're talking about. That yes, the majority of shoes out there, unless it's a pure orthopedic shoe with somebody with balance issues, really should have a bevel to mimic the heel rocker of the foot. It's important mechanism for efficiency with gait. It is a very normal part of the human anatomy, and especially as shoes are getting higher and higher in stack heights, you need to try to replicate that or it's going to feel really clunky and not very comfortable. That said, there's a balance, right? Somebody like me might like a huge posterolateral one because it really helps roll me forwards, gives me a little bit more stability. Someone like David might not need as big of a bevel and certainly not as big of a posterolateral one. That might be a little bit better to have it just be slightly smaller or just a little bit more moderate, or like, everything kind of in moderation, so to speak. But that's kind of our complicated way of saying it depends, but hoping that helps give you a little more clarity as to why we talk about bevels and why they are really important to talk about. Did I miss anything on that? Did we miss anything?
I think we just talked about heel bevels for 40 minutes.
I know. That's pretty impressive.
That is pretty impressive.
I would have thought, that's more impressive that we actually able to condense it down to 40 minutes, not spend like 4 hours talking about this. But
I was a little curious to see how this would go for the listeners that have been here for a while. You guys know how passionate Klein can get about heel bevels. I was getting ready to pull some popcorn and just like sit back here and just let you go and just see what happens on this wild ride. But we've kept it contained.
I think years of doing this podcast and also teaching and watching students get bored as you drone on, or patients get bored, it's like, all right, we got to like wrap this up. I thought we were going to be done like at 20, 25 minutes. And I realized, oh my gosh, we have all this other stuff we got to talk about. But as always, we hope this helps. We are always putting out new content, and there's many, many different avenues that you can see, watch, observe, read, whatever you take in on social media and other areas. Obviously, the biggest area is our website where we produce the most content, whether it's reviews, guides, anatomy discussions, all this kind of stuff, talking about shoes and how they impact us. We obviously have a YouTube channel. We have different avenues for the podcast, for Spotify, iTunes, and what have you. We also have got a Hoppin' LinkedIn page, and I got to keep giving Bach the shout out for that because it's actually like taken off, and it's really exciting to watch that there and connect with a lot of the people in the industry there. But again, you can find us anywhere. As always, we really hope this helps you explain kind of what's either going on with your body, what's going on with shoes. And as always, keep asking questions and stick around because we'll have more for you.